All right. So we've been trying to schedule this for quite a while. Because we were planning on doing this over summer of 2020 originally is when we had planned on trying to.
Yeah, we had a conversation. There was technical errors, and
Yeah.
had to try again.
Yeah. But I mean, as far as sorting out the differences of opinion on the big five, because if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you started off as a psychology student and then you went into
No, no,
philosophy.
no. I finished my degree in psychology, but I had a minor in philosophy. I added that secondary on.
Oh, okay.
Psychology is my main thing.
Oh, okay. So what part of psychology were you specializing in, or was it more like a general psych like undergrad degree?
I mean, it was a general psych undergrad degree, but I definitely had a concentration in like behavior and cognitive psych. I specifically really cared about working with teenage years, like age 9 to like age 15. I really cared about that group. So I took a lot of child development classes of behavioral parenting, stuff like that, interpersonal relationships. I always had this idea that if I was going to treat kids, it's important to treat as a family, not just as individuals. So that's kind of what I put my focus onto.
Okay. Yeah, I'm more focused on adulthood than children and adolescence, just because adolescence is a tough time as it is, and
Hmm.
I think it takes a special type of person with a special temperament to be able to handle family systems, especially when it comes to dealing with young children and adult and young, well, what would you say, older children and adolescent age persons.
Yeah.
So cognitive and behavioral, so not necessarily personality, like that
I
was.
I took one class called Theories of Personalities, and the professor was really cool, and he said I go to his office hours, and this is mainly where I kind of got my view on personality psychology, and um, yeah, and especially when I looked at research surrounding personality psychology and like how they obtain the metrics, I found a big flaw in it, and
Okay,
I,
so what's the flaw, do you think?
I think one of the flaws is how like these concepts were even derived. We're talking about the lexical hypothesis, where they looked at the dictionary and they split it up and found specific words have specific meanings. And they asked big five, big four, big three. And from then they moved on to try to build models using statistics and experimentation. I think the flaw here is that we're not dealing in anything that's really observable, right? These personality traits are, it's not that because we observe the behavior and we categorize it, we observe the trait, we actually looked for these traits and now we are working to try to substantiate them.
Okay. So just to make sure I understand that, your issue is because it's based on the lexicon coming from the dictionary and how they were factored together. And so it's not like observable behaviors. It's more like
Yeah.
ways to describe a person and then using statistics to kind of reliably test for it to see if there
Yeah.
are
And again, I don't, I think I mentioned, I don't think personality sky is useless. I think that the ocean model and the big five is taken to places where it doesn't necessarily need to lie. For example, like I think last time I asked you a question, I don't remember the answer. That in what clinical setting do we use the big five to diagnose, treat, like which therapeutic models are based on it? I think it has much theoretical utility, and I think it's definitely on the forefront of trying to understand personality. I don't know if there needs to be a paradigm shift or whatever, but I don't see these concepts translate over into any real pragmatic clinical psychology. Like you use the MMPI to classify disorders, you don't use the big five.
well, you're right. For diagnostic, you don't really use the big five in a lot. Now you can use something that takes like traits into consideration. There's one, it's called the Computerized Assessment of Traits for Personality Disorder, that looks at it from a big five framework. It's called the cat PD.
Mm-hmm.
um I think it can be useful. Like I said, I see where you're coming from, and you're right. It's not the big five's not really used in a clinical sense. It's more of a theoretical and research base. If you're looking at, okay, are there differences between the sexes and certain traits, or things of that nature?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it has utility there. That's undeniable.
Yeah,
It has
the
utility
clinical
there.
utility that I think it can be used for is, and this is something Dr. Colin DeYoung out of the University of Minnesota has looked at, is dimensionality of traits as far as how they manifest themselves when it comes to personality disorders. So, for example, borderline personality, just pulling one out of the hat, it's characterized by, emotional instability in interpersonal relationships. The diagnostic criteria kind of goes
Is
on.
that a personality trait, instability in interpersonal relationships?
It's part of the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. It's one of
Okay.
the characteristics of the disorder.
And that correlates to which one do you say?
Well, you could say that, emotional instability is factored into neuroticism. It's part of the volatility aspect of that trait.
Okay.
So I would hypothesize that there might be predictor scores within, aberrantly high or aberrantly low in certain traits of the big five that could predict personality disorders. So like if you're looking at somebody who's emotionally unstable, maybe very disagreeable, maybe high in extroversion, that might sound more like narcissistic personality, because narcissistic people tend to be emotionally unstable because they can't handle harsh criticism. They're not particularly agreeable. That's the lack of empathy component, but their extroversion is particularly assertiveness at a very high end would be that grandiose idea of self and how that would play itself out, because assertiveness and extroversion, the way I understand it, it's not assertiveness like how you would assert yourself, to the point of holding back before aggression, but more of being able to assert your being in the world and be comfortable in the world, kind of thing, if that makes any sense.
Sure. And this is a cool hypothesis, and if it turns out that you can design research around it and figure that out, that would absolutely make. And there's actually predictive power in the way that you can measure teens or young adults, and therefore predict these behaviors or predict these. I would totally be for it. I just haven't seen that research.
Yeah, it hasn't been. As far as I know, it hasn't really been done. The closest thing that you could look at is a paper that de Jong published in 2016 about 10 aspects of the big five in its congruence with the DSMs, the PD5, which is the personality disorder for DSM-5.
Let me just look it up real quick. I'm interested. But keep going. Who was it again? Who are the authors?
It was Dr. Colin de Jong and de Jong. Every time I say Jung, I want to say Jung because of my.
I mean, you read a lot of Jung, so that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And
I can actually go through Facebook message.
Yeah, just send it to me. And even if it's behind a paywall, I'll just use Sci-Hub. And
oh no, I have it on my Jump Drive.
Okay.
I keep a lot of personality articles on my Jump Drive along with a lot of other articles, because that is an area that I definitely in research that I definitely want to go into when I do get into a PhD program. Is I want to pursue that.
What do I want to say? No, yeah, that would be really cool. So other than speculation and academic guessing or not guessing, informed guesses, academic guesses, not just blind, I'm making shit up. What leads you to really love personality psychology? Where do you really see it, like as a way to explain things better, as a way to treat people better? Like, where do you see its power? Is it personal? Is it academic? Is it research based? Like, where do you see that from?
I'd love to see it. I would definitely love to see it as far as like clinical research and predictor scores. Maybe we could come up with a personality instrument that's far more reliable and can push up the reliability and push up the validity as far on test and retest, so that way we can really nail down.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I'm totally
not just the big five, but it's lower order facets or the 10 aspects of personality, because that's what de Jong, Quilty, and Peterson in 2007, when they came up with the big five aspect scales, was taking the five and breaking them down into its 10 lower order facets, so that you could better understand traits. Like conscientiousness is not a trait that is very well understood, because it's not something that's really modeled in the animal kingdom. It's a trait. You could say that it's traits and behaviors that are unique to humans. For example, industriousness. That's the ability to sacrifice the present for the future. It's not like bears are conscious of the fact that they're going out and gathering food before they go hibernate. It's just part of an instinctual thing.
What's the operation? What's the more like measurable definition of that? So, so you someone who knows, like, how would you measure industriousness? Like, I'm under the assumption that almost all personality inventories are a type of self-report quizzing.
They are. So,
okay.
So what you would look at is, let me try to pull this up if I can. Oh, where are you? I'm trying not to have to go searching for things for like 10 minutes.
No. You don't have to just talk to me, like, because you study this and personality. And I took one theory of personalities class. Of course, when Peterson came onto the scene, it reinvigorated my thinking. When Peterson started talking, because anyone who listens to Jordan Peterson, all my disagreements with him, if you know about them, they're there. But when it comes to the things he says about clinical work, and people suffer from agoraphobia, assertiveness training, and all this, he's 100% right. Anything he said in clinical approach, I very seldomly come across something that I've disagreed with, and if I do, it is nothing more than just I prefer to use this model or this method, and he has a different method. They're both valid.
Yeah.
Right.
So for industriousness, so some of the questions they'll have you talk about is, okay, on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, 1 being least like you, 5 being the most like you, it's like carrying out your plans, or do you waste your time, or do you find it difficult to get down and actually do the work? How do you mess things up? Do you finish what you start? Put your mind on the task at hand, or don't put your mind on the task at hand? How do you get things done quickly? Do you always seem to know what you're doing? Do you postpone decisions, or are you easily distracted? And all those things factor into the industriousness part of it. You could look at it as dutifulness and work ethic if you wanted to kind of try to simplify it down to what industriousness kind of indicates.
And what's usually from what I know, the internal validity usually has about a 0.1 core, like, it shifts very much most of the time.
Oh yeah.
Personality. So no, I know that extroversion and introversion tend to swap a lot over a shorter period of time, and then some other traits also tend to swap, not as early as introversion, extroversion, but as time moves on, you take the test again, it will change.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Even life events, like for example, for women, they tend to become more agreeable when they have children.
So with that in mind, when we do this personality inventory, would you say that we are measuring the current state of a person's?
Well, it is a self-report.
It's a self-report, right? So with knowing that the internal validity is low, I mean, have you seen any, like, because I'm just interested in this, have you seen any or you have any ideas about how to increase that validity? Like, what specific tests we can do other than just a simple self-report to really kind of get to figure out where this is going?
Unfortunately, I think that's the best that we have so far, self-report. Like, unless there was a way to measure personality based on like observed behaviors, but then again, you get into
right, like children. You could do it with children, right?
Maybe there's a way to do that with children. You could, but you do kind of run into a little bit of a problem there, because then your research methods tend to have a bigger impact on it. For example, social psychology likes to do a lot of experiments in the wild, setting up these experimental situations out in the real world, and you can't really account for all the variables. Whereas in a lab, you can try to control for every variable possible.
Yeah. But social psych, with the increase of statistical methods and better mathematics out there, I know one of the things that shocked me is when I was doing like research and methodology class, we were talking about 4 ways ANOVA, the power and how much different variables it can account for. Is fantastic. So, and so like the reason I brought up kids, because that's kind of where I work. I can definitely see you can developing some operational definitions, one that you can clearly look at. Oh, has this operation been done? Has this not been done? So we'll score this as introversion versus extroversion, right? Has there been research into that? Have you seen that?
That I don't know. Like I said, most of my research has been in with adults, and especially as they relate to different personality disorders. So openness, for example, intellect and aesthetics. It doesn't seem that intellect, and it has nothing to do with IQ, or doesn't really correlate with IQ. It's just, interest in ideas. If you're higher in intellect than say aesthetics, you're going to be more likely to be into the hard sciences, engineering, technology, more interested in things and gadgets of that nature and abstract ideas, whereas aesthetics is, poetry, art, nature, things of that nature. And so it seems that openness itself, or the aesthetics part, is what correlates to psychoticism at the extremes because of the fantastical thinking. Because it's like I forget the word for it, but it basically means like it's like the brain causes your cognition and the way that you see the world. It's like false positives. You start to misinterpret things in the world around you, and that's kind of where you could kind of see the delusions part of psychosis kind of tend to come from. Because
so we might not disagree as much as we thought we did.
No.
I think that maybe the place that I very much have an issue with is the way in which personality psychology is used in pop psychology.
I have the same issue. Like, for example,
the Myers-Briggs has 16 personalities.
16 different types. And I actually caused a bit of a kerfuffle when I was doing that mental health counseling program, because that's one of the things that they like to use. And I'm like, well, the only valid and reliable dimension as far as the 16 different types is the introversion extroversion dimension. But that's because there's factored in neuroticism and extroversion from a big five perspective. The rest of them, it pretty much depends on how you're feeling that day. And so I don't like the Myers-Briggs. I think it's well, I mean, the two ladies, it pretty much, when you look at the history of the Myers-Briggs, they openly admit that they bastardized Jung's ideas of psychological types. They read his book and thought it was like the end all be all of personality. And, Jung is very difficult to understand even outside of a narrative context. So it's no bloody wonder that it's not a very good measure of personality if you don't really understand Jung and his psychological types. And there's a lot of things that, Jung hadn't even fully sorted out yet. So it like I said, I don't think it's a good, reliable, valid instrument. It is an assessment. You can use it, but I just don't think it's very good.
So when it comes to Big Five, you think that it's, again, useful as an assessment for research, for still developing theories of what a personality is, but it's not a working, powerful enough explanation to use medically or
more research needs to be looking at the correlations between certain traits, behaviors, whether they're adaptive or maladaptive, and what the strong correlation would be for certain personality disorders. So you'd have to look at a personality disorder, look at the diagnostic criteria, and try to figure out how they fit, and say, how they can be defined by the lexical thing. And then you can kind of figure out, okay, well, is interpersonal relationship, the instability there, is that more of a extroversion neuroticism set of traits there, because your enthusiasm or assertiveness or your withdrawal or volatility can be influenced by the people around you? Or does it have something to do with, say, agreeableness, because compassion, politeness, that's kind of socially mediated as well. So there's still a lot of things that need to be sorted out in that. And
one of my favorite things that, for example, because I grew up in Israel, many people who are very religious, and who have so in Judaism, there's this idea that Hebrew is like God's language, very much similar to Islam. And there's many people in the psych field who here live in New York, who I'm acquainted to because of my background, who I spoke with someone who was like, oh, the reason why the Big Five is problematic because it uses the English lexicon. If you use the Hebrew lexicon from the Torah, it's more accurate, and you really have 7 traits of personality. Right? He'll say stuff like that.
Well, there's the Big Five, there's the hexaco, there's all the different variations thereof. I mean, when McCrae and Costa back in the 1980s were working with it, they were looking at neuroticism, extroversion, and openness.
But for me, it's like I think that anytime we rely on linguistics and language to orient our world understanding, we're gonna hit that point where the problem becomes the language. And I feel like in many ways it could be that the biggest problem with personality psychology in its moment, as with the big five being the main leader, is that language is that which holds it back. For example, self-assessment, the way people think, the way people conceive of their personality.
Yeah,
It could be what,
well, pre-literate societies that are still around, they don't really think in terms of agreeableness, openness, or anything like that. So that kind of causes a bit of a problem too.
that's
So,
true.
so I mean, you can take foreign languages and you can translate them to English, and you can kind of get some sort of cross-cultural reliability. Now, it might vary depending on which language you're translating from. And I'm not fluent in other languages. I might know a few words here and there that I've picked up, but that might have, and it probably does have an impact on its reliability and validity, no doubt about that. One of the other things that I think the big five can be useful for is, how do you go about like treating your clients? So for example, if you have a client who's very high in openness and low in conscientiousness, they might be, what would you say? They probably would do better with more open-ended type therapies like psychoanalytic therapy, or,
Oh, do you have research on
psychotherapy.
that? You can send me afterwards. I just don't know about that.
Let me see what I have in the folder, because
I mean, if you don't, that's fine. But I'm sure I can just
I
look it up.
remember reading something about it, and I thought, "Ooh, that's interesting. I need to save that." So let me.
Yeah, for sure. But while you do that, if that's true, then that would be a plus. But I told you again, I don't really research much personality psychology. It's not really my point of interest. But because one of the things that again, I think like people overuse personality psychology for is for trying to understand politics. I think that personality psychology is much more individual focused, about an individual, a personhood, versus looking at groups. And I think group behavior and group beliefs don't necessarily translate over into the individual so well, especially with the limited scope of psychology and how much we even understand about the brain. And a good example, I think, of that is a research paper. Where was it? It was done in political affiliations. It was where the research is. Hannah Back at the London University, where they were trying to do correlations with political beliefs, and the highest correlations they found was 0.24 and the lowest was like 0.14. And that's just it's not there yet, right?
Yeah, it's not the highest correlations that you can find, unfortunately.
Personally, I would just take that as interesting. It's good data, but I wouldn't draw any causal connections between the two.
I remember writing a paper, or I read it, but
That's okay. Don't worry about it now. I think it's fine. I'll just take your word.
I'll have to go through the
Yeah.
file and folder and see what's in there, because one of the things they talked about is like, if you're trying to figure out what pragmatically what's going to work, you want to work with a therapy that's going to match your client's temperament.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a client that's very conscientious and not very open-minded, then strict behavioral therapies to solve the problems in the immediate term, rather than getting to the root of the problems to begin with, is probably going to be more practical and work better for them, rather than trying to get them to.
I mean, yeah, but we know that like psychoanalysis has an efficacy of around 33% of the time. I think it's still the textbook, right? And we know that DBT has for 33% of the time. All these different, even going and speaking with your spiritual leader or finding your community has an efficacy. We have found by looking at doing basic surveys, and we have 33% of the time.
Yeah,
and we know that really, when you look at therapy, the way it really gets solved most of the time in clinical is medication plus therapy.
yeah.
Then we see a much higher success rate as a reduction of symptoms and problems.
Yeah. Now, the one place I would challenge that is like depression, right? Because many people get depressed for many different reasons, and so one of the questions I would ask is, well, what does your life look like? Do you have intimate relationships, whether it be with friends,
Yeah, of course.
loved ones? Do you have a job? Do you where is your life functioning? Because if your life's functioning fairly well, but you're still depressed, then that might point to something going on with the neurotransmitters in the brain, and an antidepressant would help sufficiently. But if someone doesn't have a whole lot of friends, they don't have a relationship, things aren't going good with their family, they don't have a job, then, perhaps we need to help you get yourself together first before.
Yeah, I agree.
And that could be the cause of the depression.
Mhm.
And that's one of the,
Which is why in many respects, a big thing that I've always advocated for was, a lot of times we know that extremely comorbid with depression is anxiety. Anxiety to complete tasks, anxiety to do things like taking on burdens. And in many ways, like an anti-anxiety medication, like any type of Lexapro or anything of that type of the like, reduces the anxiety, allows them to start building habits and dealing with that current emotional impotent and slowly start weaning them off the medication in many respects. And
also
so very,
figuring out what they might be afraid of too, so that way they can
yeah,
accurately face the exposure.
100%, 100%, yeah. Yeah, all that stuff is great. I'm totally down. I don't think we disagree as much as at
No,
least it seemed the other time, and maybe we spoke past each other a bit.
I think that's what it was, is we never really got down to the bare bones. What's the disagreement here? Because, like I said, clinically, I would like to see the research go into, okay, like, for example, you can hypothesize and probably predict very reliably if a person's very low in, say, agreeableness and very low in extroversion, that you're probably looking at somebody with antisocial personality disorder, because low agreeableness predicts antisocial behavior, because the reverse end of compassion and politeness, and that's in the DeYoung paper that I sent you, that callousness and exploitativeness. Now, a hypothesis I have that I would love to figure out how to sort out is, I think you can weed out the psychopathic predatory types versus the resentful, want to burn everything to the goddamn ground types, based on callousness versus predatory callousness.
As long as you can measure it and like figure out the other variables and
Oh yeah,
account for the correlation. Oh yeah. If you can do that, why not? That sounds great.
But I mean, it's a good hypothesis, because I've working in the prison and working at the state hospital, I've met people with antisocial personality disorder who aren't predatory. They just are resentful because life didn't treat them very well. They're angry at the world, and they want to make everybody just as miserable as they are.
Yeah, or they just, or sometimes it's just, I don't care. Sometimes it's I want to do this for myself. There's many different reasons for how we behave. I mean, a good way, I don't think it's at the point now where it's even in a consideration, but once I think the correlations get high enough in personality psychology, you can start trying to map specific fMRI scans while observing certain stimuli and correlate those with certain behaviors. And that's the steps it needs to take forward to even be considered in any real pragmatic way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I can send you a file right now on what they call personality neuroscience and personality disorder, which is actually kind of cool. I thought that was a really,
that's interesting.
Personality neuroscience in the 5-factor model. There we go. And sent. So, I mean, like I said, I've been reading every article that I can get my hands on, because, I want to see where the studies are going, and what good, where is it going, and just how much better can we be at measuring personality traits along the big 5, because that is the most reliable and valid we have. That's why it's at the top, right? That's why it's the most accepted and reliable and valid right now as far as personality models, but it's probably by no means anywhere complete.
Yeah, if I would say, you take Erikson's stages of development. I think maybe just finish teething. It's crawling around and just now it's starting to interact with its peers and those around them. It's not self-fledging and functioning.
No, and so another thing I've been thinking about too is in regard to Jungian archetypes is, thinking of the archetypes as just patterns of behavior that just are, they're so distinct that we can represent them archetypically, and they can be embodied and acted out. And it's kind of like the great mother, the terrible mother archetypes. They're patterns of behavior that we've been able to abstract out, kind of put a name onto, and we know it when we see it acted out, kind of thing.
So I'm very curious about your fascination with Jung, and because of course I see Jung, I see archetypes as psychological history. I see the development into personality, psych specifically, and the impact it had on that. Right? You look at Freud's work, Adler's work, and how it but I don't look at their writing as anything more than the same way I would look at the writings of Descartes. Right? Like, sure, the cogito, great point, helped philosophy out, but I'm not here, looking at Descartes back for some ancient wisdom about whatever it might be, his political ideas or vice versa. And I think that in the same way that you look at Freud and you think to yourself, oh, good observation about psychosexual development, good observation about specific things, let's move on forward. I think taking his writing seriously on religion and where religion comes from, and taking his writing seriously on sociology is ridiculous. And I feel it, and I don't know, because you always end up referring to Jung. Where's your love of Jung come from?
Well, it really comes from when I started listening to Jordan Peterson, and really, because when I was in undergrad, we covered Jung just on the basics of the idea of the complexes and the Myers-Briggs, and a little bit on the archetypes, but it wasn't really explained really well. It's kind of like a brief overview when you're looking at like the psychoanalysts, because that's where they kind of put Jung as like this bridge between the psychoanalysts and the personality psychologist. He kind of just he's the transitional figure, you could say, going from psychoanalytic theory to personality psych because of his analytical psychology. But it was very, very brief in Psych 101. And, it's one of those, I knew the name, but I never really looked at it. And then, so taking Peterson's advice and trying to kind of get my life together, I was like, okay, I'm not going to just take Peterson, just strictly get his word of what he says is true. I'm going to go back and read the things that he read, validate it. And that's why my reading list is so large, and the amount of books that I've bought is just crazy, because it's like, okay, I know he has the recommended reading list, but I've diverged from it as well, kind of expanding on it. And so the first book I read was Modern Man in Search of a Soul. It's one of his, one of the ones that he recommends people read from Jung. And I was like, okay, well, I read it, and there were some things that Jung talked about that really kind of sat with me, that I really thought about, like in Modern Man Search for a Soul. He talks about the need for adversity, that you don't see personal growth without adversity. So instead of becoming bitter about it, you should be thankful for it, because that's how you build your characters, through these things of adversity that you go through. And now that's may not be the exact wording. It's been a long time since I've read it, by about 2 or 3 years.
It's like the what doesn't kill you make you stronger type of thing.
Yeah, because Jung did study Nietzsche, and I do have Jung's book on Thus Spake Zarathustra. So haven't read that one yet, but I kind of dug it. So I was like, okay, well, now I want to read more. And so after that, I read The Undiscovered Self, and I read An Answer to Job. And then when Maps of Meaning, when I finally got my copy of it and tried to read it, I got like 2 chapters in, and I was like, okay, I don't understand any of this. And that's when I went back and read The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. And I also read his treatise on dreams. In fact, I read Jung's book on dreams right after I read Freud's interpretation of dreams, just kind of to have that continual thing to it. And then when I went back and read Maps of Meaning, I think I had a better grasp of it.
But this is all like in the territory of philosophy of mind. You would agree, right?
I think I think that's a fair statement. Yeah. Like I said, looking at the archetypes and the collective unconscious, we can sit here and say that we could probably agree that there probably isn't some out there beyond us reservoir of all these archetypal images that we all share.
The platonic world versus the ideal, right?
But I would say that,
which is where I think Jung very drew that idea from, right? The world of ideals. Yeah, drew that parallel. There's this idea, but we're all connected to it in a sense.
Yeah, the web of weird. If you
panentheistic type of perspective.
Yes. So I started thinking, well, what what could the collective unconscious be if we're going to try to ground it in something more real? And this is where I got the idea that maybe what it is it's these abstracted patterns of behavior that we know what they are, even if we don't know that we know it, kind of thing.
Like the Zeitgeist, in a way, Hegel's Zeitgeist.
I see. I haven't read much Hegel, so I can't really comment. It's the way I think about it's like, okay.
But you know what the Zeitgeist is, right? Even if you didn't read Hegel, you know the Zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the time, right? That which kind of,
Yeah.
it's like it's described as the force.
Yeah.
Way, right? It moves through you, you interact with it, you're not aware of it, you're influenced by it, you influence it.
Because kids, most kids typically, try to play out the role of mother and father. And it's not like they know what mother and father is. They just kind of imitate certain behaviors that are seen by their parents across all these different situations and kind of abstract it out.
Unless if you don't grow up with a parent, then you have some distorted idealizations of what it means to be a dad, and one of the things
Hence
that I
why
found is
typical,
like many people who, for example, they grew up with an abusive dad or a regular dad or not a dad, and they have kids, they'll end up being, many of the times from my experience, so lenient with them because they always wanted to have a dad like that, a dad who would love them and spend time with.
It comes borderline Oedipal in a sense, the devouring parent, because it's like overprotective.
Not necessarily not even overprotective. It's just be like, oh, dad's gonna play with you now, not putting specific boundaries, maybe something very permissive. I've seen much less authoritarianism and authoritative or neglectful behavior, just a very permissive one where
we're not gonna be your parent, we're gonna be your friend and let you do whatever you want. And
or it's any of the like, but it simply comes from like they just didn't have a father or a father that worked well because people
because they're overcompensating for the fact they didn't have that type of parent growing up.
They're trying to model the behavior that they think is necessary. They're always well-meaning most of the time.
But again, it's an idea of what a father should be, or what they think a father should be. And so there is that archetypal representation there. It's incomplete. I think we can agree with that, but that's still a representation.
Yeah, sure.
As an embodied, enacted out pattern of behavior. And so I was thinking, well, maybe it's patterns of behavior that we just kind of tend to know what they are, and we embody them and we act them out, even if we don't know that's what it is, especially until you don't really figure it out until you get to about adulthood, and then you can kind of better label or categorize the pattern of behavior and its abstraction.
Yeah. Also, of course, the development of the frontal lobe, you're more aware of your behaviors as well. You're able to be like, why am I doing this? Wait a second, et cetera, et cetera. But this is known by every sociologist and any behavioral theorist.
Yeah. So I would say that if there is a collective unconscious, that would be the best way that you could try to ground it in something real, is just like you said, we have these abstractions of these patterns of behavior that we try to imitate, embody, and act out. And as we grow older, then we're able to better categorize those patterns of behavior. But they're still archetypal in a sense.
Mm-hmm. That's how you can look at them through an archetypal framework. I don't know what might much be the conceptual utility of that from a philosophical perspective, because I think that any good philosophical answer reduces questions and helps understand and clarify and kind of move along. And Auguste Comte, the philosopher that I really like, and he moves through these phases of any type of what are they called? I'll just say magisteria. So he starts what he calls like the theological phase, the metaphysical phase, and the positive phase. So he looks, for example, we can look at cosmology or chemistry. It started with, well, the sun is a god. He would be like, that's a theological phase, right? This chemical reaction is the god Anubis, whatever it might be, bubbling lava, whatever it might be, the water turning red, etc. That is, look, it's the god. We're seeing the god there. The god just flowed through a river. Metaphysical stage would be, no, these are things that are happening in the world, but the gods are making them happen. And then a positive would be, it can be understood through observation, empiricism, tests, etc., etc. And I think that psychology, I mean, you would agree psychology is what, 120 years old as it proper?
Yeah.
As we know it today with modern theories. even less. You can even say it's less. You say it's 80 years old, starting in the 50s and 60s, with the advent of behavioralism, right past psychoanalysis. I think psychology is making that movement from a
Philosophy
metaphorical,
from philosophy to
metaphorical,
science.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because I look at psychology started off as a philosophy because
All
many of
things
the
did,
first
right?
proto psychologists were philosophers. I went through that in my very first. What would be like if I were teaching Psych 101? How would I teach it? So I bring up like Plato and Socrates and John Locke and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and all of those that were really.
Can't forget William James, right?
And William James is one of the first psychologists as far as like trying to,
Help people.
well, not only that, but he was trying to move it past the philosophy to something that
Yeah,
could
he
be
was.
tangible, because
Mhm.
he's actually really the father of experimental psychology.
I mean, and this is the thing. Me as a pragmatist, in many respects, I find like William James and Charles Peirce are that embodiment, which is, I think, my biggest issue with personality psychology. It's yet to get into that pragmatic sphere. It hasn't been with, even with all our modern research tools and experimentation and observation. It just has not been able to draw correlation strong enough to, you know, find the buddy in the other fields of psychology yet in a real meaningful way.
I can understand that. I can. I think personality psychology is really useful, like you said, at individuals, and this is kind of goes back to where I've been so, I guess, vocal in my criticisms about the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's because authoritarianism is a bottom up process. And it starts at individual responses to disease prevalence and parasite stress. That's something that Dr. Thornhill um, wrote about in a few of his
Right, but
papers.
but there's so much research about how authoritarianism begins, and the sociological models, political science models, are much more comprehensive at even predicting this than any personality psychology could ever, I think, dream of in the current science.
That may very well be. I'm just saying that, one of the things that they look at as a predictor is discuss sensitivity. And that's from the study in right wing authoritarianism right after World War II, because of, the Holocaust and what happened there with Hitler was just so. I don't even know if there's really I don't think there's proper words for just how, what would you say, surprised, shocked, caught unawares that something like that could happen, that human beings could do that to one another on that scale.
I mean, I think it was a hubris of Europe. Look at other areas of the world. Mongolians existed, Romans existed. I'm pretty sure humans can do terrible things to each other on such a scale. I know my great grandparents, they escaped Germany on my dad's side before the Holocaust. They were like, nope. On my mom's side, they're like, we see the writing on the wall. If we don't live here, we're about to die. But I know Freud also ran away at a certain point. But I want to understand which response are you worried about, like vaccine
It's
mandates or
the discussed response amongst individuals that could
no,
lead.
like so where do you I'm curious of where do you see this authoritarianism coming from? Like which response are you worried about? Is it both parties, one party? How do you view this?
It's both parties. And like I said, I look at it from individuals. So like we can look at the vaccine mandates, right? Now, one argument is that we've had vaccine mandates before, and everybody points to, forget which vaccine it was in like 19, is it the 1920s or 30s, that if you didn't get it, it was like the equivalent of like a $5 fine back then, which would be the equivalent of about $150 in today's
I mean, you can also
money.
look at softer mandates, like, oh, you want to come be in school, got to get the MMR vaccine,
Yeah,
got to get the
softer
measles,
softer
polio, right?
mandates and stuff like that. And on its face, you can make a good argument for or against it. I think when you have to start showing your card to participate in public utilities, I think that that's a problem.
I only think it's a problem in. I mean, would you not say that school for young kids is a public utility?
But you're not having, your kid doesn't have to pull out a card to show that they're vaccinated. It goes in their record and only the administration sees it. It's not like the police are telling your kid to show their papers or they can't go to school, or asking of parents to show their child's medical records to be admitted into the school. So
Well,
I would say that there's a
I
difference
live
in how
in
it's being carried out.
I live in New York,
I know, I
and
know.
most of the time I've never like had to pull out my phone. Like I have the Excelsior pass on my phone. If I have to go into like a courthouse or something, or whatever it might be, depending on the time. Again, courthouses, everyone can go in, so it wasn't a good example. But if you have to go into a specific public place that isn't like you don't have to go there. It's not like a utility or anything. They'll ask me to show proof that I'm vaccinated, whether I can
Well, maybe
send them.
public utility may have been the wrong wording. It's kind of, there was a video that came out of New York. Tim Pool and a couple of other people shared it, of what appeared to be a family at a restaurant, and 15 NYPD come in asking for proof of vaccination, or you have to leave, and if you don't leave, you'll be arrested for trespassing.
Well, that I mean, for me, so me as someone who's much more socialist leaning, I think there's an issue at all that private companies can choose whatever they want to
Oh,
do.
I understand the private company
No,
part.
no, no, no. So, for
It's
example,
the behavior.
my gym that I go to doesn't ask for vaccines, right? It says if you're unvaccinated, keep a mask on. If you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, but
Yeah, it's
everyone's got a
whatever.
social distance, whatever. I will never. No, I put on a mask even though I'm vaccinated. I just kind of want people to stay away from me, but I work out.
And that's fine. That's your choice.
Except if I'm running. But again, I also think that a gym says, hey, if you want to be here, associate with us, show me that you're vaccinated. I think it's the right with any private company, any company I go work for can mandate to see my vaccines, my medical history. If I don't want to have that contract with them, that's fine. It's not like I need them necessarily, right? It's not like a public
I can
thing.
understand your argument, and again, I'm not trying to straw man an argument here. I'm just, for me, I find the behavior disturbing because it's too similar to what happened in the past, and people that don't really understand that are going to be. I would hope I would be wrong, but they might be stupid enough to repeat it. And now it's like Caleb called me out on this yesterday, saying, "Do you really think there's going to be another Holocaust? Is that what you think? Because that sounds paranoid and delusional." And says maybe I should stop reading the books that I've been reading lately. And no, I don't think we're going to see government sanctioned extermination of people who are unvaccinated.
I think we can. I think we might be able. I don't think it's possible now in the short term. I don't think.
But I could see
the timeline can branch in that direction, right? It happened before. It happened.
Yeah, it happened before, but I would say that the more likely scenario is you get a group of stupid individuals that decide that they don't want their health at risk, and so they're going to take people out before something happens to them. Kind of like what happened with the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s.
I mean, if it gets to that point, I think that I think we'd need a much stronger pandemic for that to be the case.
But I could just see there have been individuals that have taken the response to it to an extreme. Now,
yeah, there's been individuals also like the other way around who have taken it's not a big deal.
Yeah, they've taken that's right. They've taken a more laissez-faire approach to it.
Yeah, they're both dealing with fears, right? There's the don't look at it, put it on the carpet. There's the hyper focus. I have a good friend of mine who was like Lysoling her bags at the beginning of the pandemic. It was like, this is not how this works, right? Like you're gonna be fine. And she's generally very fear averse. She's very afraid of new things. And
but what I'm getting at is that at the individual levels, this is where you can start to see problems happen, and that's why I think it's important to say something. And that's part of that is because I did take an interest in the psychology of what happened with the Holocaust and what happened in the Soviet Union and all of that. And of course that again influenced by Peterson there of, okay, well, you said that being forced to use certain words is going to lead a certain path. Well, let me read about it and let me come to my own conclusions. And
you see, so I think actually there's much better metrics for figuring out whether we're close to authoritarianism or fascism or whatever it might be. Because I think political scientists, their work is much more geared to understand these things. But I think that a lot of times taking psychology and applying it to sociology is problematic, let alone into governmental systems and economic systems, etc. Like, I think a big problem is, for example, rational choice theory. This is a psychological theory. They'll make rational choices. You and I, as psych majors, know that today that's not true. People don't make rational choices. People rarely make any rational choices.
Yeah,
And we
it's
have
mostly emotion based, and
and we have an entire economic system predicated on that idea. But as we go further with this same line of thinking, I think applying these different ideas, oh, well, people are risk adverse, so if people are going to ask you, we're going to look at a certain behavior like asking for papers for something, we're already getting to right-wing fascism. We're close to that. I think, for example, like Umberto Eco's 14 points are a better metric for that. You look at specific government actions, you look at specific government for example, like speech laws specifically are usually much more connected with fascism than, I don't know, during a pandemic.
like I said, it's a bottom up process. It starts off with individuals with those attitudes, and then they vote for people that tend to mirror that. That's one of the dangers with populism, right? Is that
yeah, I agree. Populism is us against them.
I think it's much deeper than that, because it's not so much that the politicians are listening to you and wanting to implement policies based on what people say they want. It's they will adjust their speech to try to tell the people that they're wanting the votes for, to tell them what they want to hear.
I mean, I think it's been the case with almost any politician at any time, right? But when I always conceive of populism is the in-group, out-group. There's us, and there's those who are exploiting us, right? Like Bernie Sanders was a populist, Trump was a populist. Bernie Sanders was us again, and then the 1%. Trump was us and the liberal elites. So that
and to give the devils their due, they do raise some very valid points. It's kind of like with the whole January 6th thing. And I said, this is something that Peterson's predicted before. And that's because the people that are seen as the elite, whether it's politicians or wealth or the wealthy, they're setting rules to a game. And everything works out as long as it's perceived that people play by the rule, play the game according to the rules of the game, and everything's fair. The moment that people start to think that everything's rigged, that's going to motivate people to kind of just want to burn shit down and just flip the chessboard.
Yeah, but that's a nice post hoc explanation, right? It's just an explanation of what's going around, trying to understand it from this specific lens. But to think about it as the explanation, for me, is going a bit far, right? Like that's why I keep talking about different lenses. I'm talking about different, like political science, or I'm talking about sociology, because I think that these fields and their methodologies can give us better explanation as to why these things occur and how they occur. So there's a professor at this university I went to, Stony Brook. I forgot his name, something Norpoth. I think it's Norpoth, who was able to predict using primary data who was going to win the election like 20 years in a row. Right, 24, like tons of years in a row, was able to predict it. Not the incumbent elections, not if the same president is running, but if both of them are new, or if they both haven't been president before, he's always got it right. My point to that is that kind of goes against many. You don't need psychology here to understand this, and I think in many ways we don't need psychology to understand why the January 6th riot happened. I think we can explain it, but there's no way for us to be like, if we see this trait and this trait and this, and then we're going to be able to predict this. It's almost like, oh, things are going south. Things are better than intuitive feeling.
I'm not in the business of predicting, right? It's more like, okay, I've read these things that have happened in history, and I've looked, like Christopher Browning wrote Ordinary Men, talked about the police battalion that went into Poland, and they were older, they weren't indoctrinated into Hitler's ideology, and by all accounts their commandant said, if you don't want to participate, you can leave. And yet they willingly underwent the transformation into cold-blooded murderers. And he did lay out, that it wasn't some Milgram experiment where they were forced to do something, that there was all these different forces at play, from they didn't want to leave their comrades to do the dirty work, to a lot of them became alcoholics. Some of them were drunk when they were carrying out some of the executions, when many of them were botched and they buried people alive under stacks of corpses. It's
some evil, whatever happened.
It's a gruesome read. Like it's not a pleasant read. And then when you try to read it from a perpetrator's point of view, it's like, Yeah, no, I think that if there is such a thing as a moral absolute, then that is absolute evil as far as I'm concerned. And so the idea would then, how do you conduct yourself so that way, if things of that nature were to happen, that you wouldn't take it.
So I think the solution, I think how you would act, I think one of them, very important, is community involvement. I think that we got to take a step back and be like, hey, our society might be made up of individuals, but our society doesn't behave in the way individuals behave. So that's why I really believe in communal action and about building a system for how to work within your community. And once you have that going and you're a part of your community, I think you're now like, how do we behave as to make sure this doesn't happen again? What rules do we have for perpetrators? What rules do we have for people who disagree with? What rules do we have for our out group? Like, democracy in itself is inherently exclusionary, as only those who we decide can vote are the ones who get to make decisions where we are. So, for example, you live in a town, let's go call it the town of Rachel. And right next door is the town of Phillips, where people in the town of Phillips have no say on what happens in the town of Rachel. They can't vote here. We have excluded them. And the only things they have, right? And then we together, we're in the town of Juniper. So we got the town of Rachel, the town of Phillips, and we're together in the hamlet of whatever, Juniper. So now whoever we elect for Juniper makes decisions for both of us. And that for me is a great model. And that's something that we really want. And breaking that down is dangerous, in my opinion. But I think that we can look back at history, look back at specific issues. We look at nation states as they existed in the 20s and 30s and 1800s. But it was what I think some of the big tensions started happening, that as the world developed, technology developed, what we actually saw is that because these states were making individualized decisions about their own state while already affecting other states, already affecting other communities. Technology was so advanced that if you lived in a Jewish village in Poland, you were affecting German citizens. Yet Germany had no way after World War I to pass any legislation or have any say in what has happened to it. Right. And I think we're seeing very similar things today in the United States. I think this is where we can kind of start drawing the parallels less. Right. So, for example, you look at how voting rights acts and, a community's right to decide how they want to vote and how that influences federal elections. Today, life in New York, where I'm from, and you're from North Carolina again, right?
Virginia.
Virginia.
I live in a rural city.
Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a
And
suburb of Richmond.
the
But
decisions that we have here in New York and the decision that you make, we're so interlinked, right? Goods travel through, highways travel through. Much more federal decisions need to be made about how we govern in between ourselves. And in many respects, the fact that New York could make decisions that affect Virginia in a way that is ridiculous, right? It shouldn't be that my state gets to dictate how, I don't know, what kind of traffic laws you have, right? That would be an insane thing. Or the fact that we could say, hey, we're raising taxes on whatever your main export is. Well, fuck, you're done. In the same way that, West Virginia's senator can stop a bill from passing, one guy can stop the whole bill, is kind of we're starting to see this problem where the federal system is so decentralized and has so little power that we're seeing states starting to fight. We're seeing people starting to get angry at each other because they have no way of solving the issues that they're affecting each other, right? You can wave your hand as far as you want as long as it doesn't hit me. Well, hands are hitting people and we have no mechanism for them to stop. And I think that's how we start seeing authoritarianism show up, when it's like, well, what are we going to do this? Well, I'm just going to tell them no. I'm just going to pass laws and tell them we'll need mechanisms. We have to expand the way we can democratically decide. I think these models are a bit old. It's time for a little bit of ratification for them. I really think that's where the issue comes from.
so if I understand correctly, your fear of the authoritarianism is more at the level that the federal government doesn't have the ability to override, like, say, you mentioned Manchin not being, standing in the way of a federal bill being passed.
Yeah, like HR1 or something.
And that's getting the states to go at one another. And that's another thing that some people have been worried about, is a civil war. I think it's more along the lines of peaceful national divorce, is what I would say would be the likely outcome if people are stupid enough to go for it. I would hope it wouldn't turn into a hot conflict, because that's not good. And
But I'm not just talking about the government's power, right? I'm saying that the way in which we federally make decisions is starting to fail because, right, the federal government is created for gridlock, right? It's created for gridlock because it was developed at a time where states had such little economic effect on another. Like the federal government was created as a way of fighting off the British. It wasn't created as a way of working within 50 states and a national highway train system. So like you look at the way Germany's government was redone right after it joined West Berlin and East Berlin, for example, and their parliamentary system, I think, makes much more sense to federally. I think would work better for us. I think parliamentary systems would work better in a federal way in the United States, where there's much less individual involvement, and then communities can focus on their states, and the states and different representatives can form coalitions and party and kind of stop this two-party system that is, for me, a symptom of this relic of a system that we have. And this is when you start thinking of authoritarianism showing up, because a system can only either step on someone to get something done or it can't, because there isn't this ability to get work done, to compromise.
Well, I do know from living in Nevada, you want to talk about rural. Elko is a very rural mining and ranching town. Like the mines and the ranches, that's pretty much what Elko's lifeblood is. And they're more traditionally conservative because, I mean, it's roughnecks, cowboys, and miners. You know, that's the types of people that live in that town. It's a rough town, and they always get upset with Reno or Vegas because, like, typically, like Elko, Eureka, if I remember correctly, only has like a population of like 35 people per that county. And so they always tend to tilt more toward the conservative end of political orientation, and then, you know, Reno, Vegas, because they're urban areas, and they tend to tilt more liberal because they have more people. And you have the universities, or their University of Nevada, Reno, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and universities typically tend to tilt more left leaning. So it causes some resentment from the smaller communities and counties toward the larger cities, and it is a problem that I don't really know how I think solve that.
I think that a good way to think about it is that, so first of all, because we're all stakeholders, what I do in Reno affects, what was the name of the county? Elko County. I think that this arbitrary division we have these are just lines drawn from all. There's no reason why these lines are there, right? Logistically, supply chain wise, these communities are interlinked. And the fact, so I think property taxes in Reno should go to Elko, and they should kind of work together. These are no longer independent areas that shouldn't have any. They should definitely have local collaboration. These governments need to start forming, like the arbitrary distinction in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Well, the tri-state area, this is what it's called here, is like some of Connecticut, some of northern New Jersey, like the inside of Long Island, a little bit of northern Manhattan. But these.
Now, do you live like in the city, or do you live like in a suburb of the city?
So right now, just because of job movement, I'm living right out of JFK, like 10 minutes out of JFK, which is the biggest airport in New York City, right on the border of Queens, but in Nassau County. Beforehand was my girlfriend. I actually lived like in Harlem for a little bit. Like I lived in Rego Park, which is city proper.
So you've lived in proper cities. So
yeah.
Okay.
So like for me, we should kind of treat the tri-state area as its own governing body, and all of a sudden start making like a northeast region with a governing body with different cities inside of it, or different hamlets or counties inside of it, rather than just the arbitrary New York state that cuts with the straight line above Pennsylvania. That makes no sense to me. And we can draw these boundaries on geological resources. For example, access to water. Hydropolitics is a phenomenal field that deals with how water and water scarcity and water resource affects a community, and organizing these boundaries based on actual assets like access to water, access to ports, access to materials, farmland, and kind of have them now start governing be a much better way than the way we do it now. And I think that's because it's so old and outdated that it's no longer functioning with our modern society. And the same was true of the Weimar Republic. The same was true of feudalism. We're just in that area where it's time to move on. Governing systems work when the material conditions are in a specific way. Now that they've changed, we have to change alongside with that. And that's what I credit mostly with the tension in the country.
And well, there's something to be said that, just because the system worked 50, 40, 60 years ago doesn't necessarily mean it works right now, right? That's definitely a problem. There's also and this is what the conservatives typically tend to think of, and it's a valid concern, is that, it's the law of unintended consequences. And that tends to manifest itself in several different ways. Now, like you said, I'm more of a psychologist than I am an economist. I'm not very good at economics. Political science didn't really interest me until I took political psychology. That I found interesting, but anything outside of that was just, it was kind of like one of
I really got into political science. I took political philosophy. And I started reading these political philosophers, and I was like, oh, okay, I see where these ideas came from. And
yeah. And that was just not an interest for me, because I always looked at politics as that's why people stop being friends with one another, or things kind of just tend to go to hell in a handbasket. And I think it's because people don't know how to talk about it, or at least talk about it honestly, because there's always that tension of like, am I going to have an opinion that someone's going to find reprehensible enough that friendships are done? Because I've seen it happen.
I mean, yeah, listen, I would never be friends with someone politically a psycho, like alt-right Nazi. I can't do it. I don't I don't know.
I'm no fan of political extremists at all. I think people.
I mean, it's only extreme insofar that is outside of our like Overton window, right?
And that's that's a good point too, and a good thing that everybody agrees where the right goes too far. Everybody agrees, and this is another problem. I'm actually going to be talking to my old psychology professor, because we disagree on a few things, and we're going to actually have a conversation, because I think we probably will agree more than we'll disagree, because like with the personality psychology topic, we found that we agree more than we disagree. Is that the line where the right goes too far? Of course, I've kind of had this idea kind of blown apart, and I'm still trying to figure that out. Typically we think of the right goes too far right along the lines of ethnic and racial superiority, the idea
any type of ethno-nationalism.
Yeah, that's that you're too far, and you're off, you're on the shelf, and you're done. We don't play with you. You're out of the sandbox, right? But the problem is where's that line on the left where it goes too far? Because
I think it's the opposite. It's a rejection of communities and people's right, or like, although, for example, like leftists will take the thing, but like, oh, self-determination, like self-determination to do what, right? You can say, oh, the southern states had the right to self-determination to have slavery. That'd be like too far in the left. Or they'll have people say stuff like, oh, we reject the concept of nations and states, absolute no borders, right? You're rejecting government as a whole. You're just rejecting them.
So for you, those are the lines where you draw of ideas that are just not acceptable.
It would be the antithesis to ethno-nationalism. No states, no, entirely, like no communities, like anarcho, like people who say like they're anarcho-communists to me are the equivalent of like far-right ethno-nationalists.
So for me, the idea, or at least the smoking pistol, or the bad idea for me, is equity, equality of outcome. Because
for me, it depends on what, like equality outcome based on what, right?
Well, so that's the thing, right? What outcomes are we talking about, and how precisely are you going to enforce it? Because individuals are not the same. So how can you have equal outcomes with individual differences?
So I think that when we look at the metric of equity, at least as I understand it, like New York State has a thing called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, the die religion, as Gad said, and other people have satirically called it.
I mean, so I'm actually in favor of DEI.
And I always question what somebody means by that when they say it, right?
Yeah. So the idea is that we accept that diversity is a thing, right? This idea.
It depends on what you mean by diversity.
I'm going to explain. Instead of seeing the United States as a melting pot, we look at it as a salad bowl, where people's identities are fair and valid. The schools should recognize people's different cultural values, different cultural holidays, and kind of try to work and accommodate that. The next one is equity, but it's not equity based on anyone. Like there's no reason why it's not radical equity. It's not, oh, everyone should get just as much playtime on the football team. No, people who outperform and meritocratically score better are the ones who are going to be playing on the football team, and those who do better in school will do better in school. But the idea is, for example, if you see equity, for example, from a more political standpoint, where let's look at a county like Suffolk County here in Long Island, and you end up seeing that for some reason people of Spanish background, Latino background are just underperforming as a whole. That means there's an inequity here, because there's nothing about being from Hispanic or Latin origin that makes you, that means that you shouldn't be able to function in an academic setting, that you should disproportionately statistically between the two groups for them to not do well in school, as school is such an important thing in this country.
The first question be like, okay, why is it happening? What's
yeah, for sure. But we should work to try to alleviate that disparity. And if schools are seeing that, then they should try to offer, translating, for example, make sure there's Spanish is also available for newer people, or tutoring in Spanish, English tutoring, like English as a second language.
So those types of solutions aren't unreasonable solutions. I would say where I think the idea of equity goes too far is like saying that you have to have certain representations, like say 50% men, 50% women on, say, like a CEO board. It's like,
yeah, but that's so one of my favorite things, and again, those are things like the arguments you'll hear if you go to like a Trump rally by like right wingers. This is what, like, if you go to like a Hillary rally, like Hillary people would say, or like talk radio, like partisan hacks would say. Because
I've seen it argued on like different programs.
Yeah. I mean, you see tons of things argued on different programs. My point is that
and when you look at like what I find to be bad, is all I'm saying is when you
I agree. I'm saying I agree that those are bad, but for me that is rife with, there's a distinction between what alleviates this issue. That's like people saying, oh, in order to fix racism, we're going to have to make sure that there's an equal amount of people in Hollywood of color winning, so we have to change the word. You can't. For me, that's nonsense. For me, language is not the direction to. You have to change material condition, and this is an argument that I have as someone on the left with other leftists all the time. I think they're absolutely, those who say it are batshit crazy. But okay, maybe I can assure your like nervousness. But here, because I do work with kids, I do work with people with special needs and development and disabled. No one is proposing such nonsense. Equity is the framework for which we evaluate whether it's successful or not. The idea is to get from things like race, ethnic background, right? These shouldn't be sex. These, when we look at the school, if females are underperforming statistically significant amount using basic stats, there's an issue that we need to address. That's an equity principle.
And figuring out what the problem is and how to solve those problems.
Yeah, but the metric is equity. Not saying, oh, well, look, the access was there, everyone has equal access to it. That doesn't solve those problems. We have to start viewing it from the lens of equity rather than the lens of equality, because it's already equal in many respects.
So how do we solve the problem of separating? Because like the way you explained it is not unreasonable. How do we separate the unreasonable from the reasonable? Because you said people that take the equity as you have to alleviate racism by having.
Oh, I would say, well, we gotta have research on it. We gotta have stats on it, right? Need some sort of, come on, show me something measurable. Where else in the world? Because governments do experimentation all the time, right? With universal basic income, whatever it might be. Show me where you've done this program and where you've seen racism be alleviated. I've yet to see one research on it, so I just throw it out. Well, but I've definitely researched that when you change material conditions, job programs, tax incentives, things do change.
Well, okay, so again, maybe I didn't ask the question the right way. It's how do we get the unreasonable people out of the conversation so that way it isn't batshit insane?
Well, I guess one of the parts of living in a democracy, honestly, is trying to organize your community. I mean, I'm really hard. Me and my friends are starting up a political activist organization here in Long Island. Can I plug it? Is that okay?
If that's what you want to do. My podcast has always been about free speech, whether you like it or not. And
So
that's an interesting thing too. But go ahead and plug it, and then we can kind
no,
of
it's just Blue Island, New York. If anyone's interested, look it up.
Blue
We're
Island, New
aiming,
York.
we're trying to be a nexus for different activist organizations to get together on the island and actually try to create change. And if you know anything about island politics, there's a lot of political and um, like nepotism going on, so it's very hard to break into any type of politics or have people run or pass any legislation. And we wanted to just have a nexus where these different activist groups can kind of get together and rally together financially behind the leaders for this for the county and for the island itself. So
Okay. Yeah. But we were talking about language and the unreasonable. I've always been a proponent of free speech, and I find it interesting that that was 20 years ago considered a liberal issue and not a conservative issue, but somehow it's flipped.
I still think it's a liberal issue. I think conservatives in many respects hide behind the veil of free speech. I think we haven't had it as less of a free speech president than we've had under Donald Trump in a long, long time. I think the GOP was willing to stand behind absolute both abuses of free speech and laws against free speech, like against stopping to teach CRT for me is a massive free speech violation.
Well, I think that's a complicated issue, and I'm not educated enough on it to really state an opinion right now. I did buy a couple of books on it. While I agreed that that banning it, I guess, it can be seen as a violation of free speech, because free speech is supposed to protect speech, even if you detest it. But I certainly think that it's okay to question its appropriateness at certain age levels. I would say.
Yeah, I mean, they're not. The big thing is that CRT isn't even really taught in most like pre-K programs. Not even close to being taught.
In Virginia, they're trying to. In Virginia,
Listen,
what's happening is
if kids could understand it, I'm 100% behind teaching CRT. Like
that I don't
cards
think
on the
kids are.
table.
I don't think kids are at the right maturity level to understand it. And anything that's critical theory is incredibly complicated. Foucault
Yeah,
work is incredibly
yeah, but
complicated.
CRT is not Foucault.
Well,
That's
critical
a bit
theory is
reductionist. That's like saying science is Descartes.
Foucault was one of the founders of critical theory when he was very
Sure,
critical of the psychoanalytic and the asylum movement in France at the time. I mean,
but CRT is an outgrowth of critical legal studies, which is applying a critical lens to the justice system and basically said, oh, look, the justice system is not fair and blind, right? That's a myth. The justice system protects those who can vote and make laws.
but
It's
why
there
are
for
we
it's a,
okay? So why would it be bleeding out of the legal education into other areas?
because what ended up happening is a post civil rights movement. A lot of legal scholars looked at race through the critical legal studies, the CLS lens, and they saw that even so, a good case of that. I'll go back with a little story. Is that in Detroit, for example, with the desegregation, where there were people, they were busing students from Black communities into white communities, trying to resegregate the schools. Once the Civil Rights Act passed and the law was, hey, you can't make any law based on race, um, parents who were against desegregation and forced segregation said, you can't bus my kid because of his race to another district for inclusion. We're not willing to go to school with those blacks. They sued the state and they won in the Supreme Court. So you ended up having race blind laws. The colorblind laws themselves were passed. The not being allowed to have colorblind laws, non-colorblind laws, in fact, perpetuated and maintained that which they were trying to overturn in the first place. And critical race theory kind of saw that and said, oh, well, thinking of law in a colorblind way doesn't actually abate racism. It can perpetuate it in some moments. And that's where CRT kind of started getting more inflation. Then you move to the 90s and education departments started looking at CRT. Okay, well, how in my school, how in my department, how in my district, even though we have zero race blind laws when it comes to schooling or sending out infrastructure in school, is that perpetuating in any way the inequity between races here? And that's kind of how it developed into where it is today.
Now, is there probability of some unintended consequences along with that.
I mean, as long as
Because
once you start implementing it, yeah, I would say, especially those who would say, you have to represent people. Oh, in band, you need 50% black, 50% white. I think that's a mistake.
I agree with you there.
And if you bought Richard, if you bought, sorry, I'm ranting. I'm gonna stop.
No, it's fine. No, go ahead.
What was the name of the book? Let me see. Critical Race Theory. It's a textbook. Which one is it? Critical Race Theory, regular 13th edition. Do you know that one? You probably bought it. It's like black and has a red stripe on it. Richard Delgado.
He wrote the book on cultural competency for counseling professions, and they kind of bring some of the critical race theory, some of the aspects of it were brought into the whole counseling thing, and from what I understand, and this was the professor talking anecdotally, that when they were teaching it in the past, that it did become very accusatory towards certain demographics. And I guess they're trying to sort that out.
I mean, so I don't want to go into a whole like diatribe here, but essentially the book opens up with this little story about how even if all the attitudes towards black people or towards people of low socioeconomic class or towards short people, whatever, even though those attitudes change, will their circumstances change? And the surrounding answer is no, that's not the way to change it. Changing attitudes is the other way around. And I would say that, just like with anything else, pop culture and the way things is understood in the popular sphere, like we talk about personality psychology, the way people use it, you'll end up having these people who go in and try having like seminars, or if you're white, you're automatically racist, you should atone for your sins. But I don't think
that's where I was going to go with it.
Yeah, so but that's not a representation of CRT whatsoever.
Okay, because I bought Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility, because
that's a horrible book.
It's being so when we had to do cultural competence and training at both Central State and when I worked at the DOC, they're actually using Robin DiAngelo's book as a means of white fragility, that if you get angry, if someone calls you a racist, it's because you're a racist, according to Robin DiAngelo. This is being taught by HR departments in the Department of Corrections and in the Department of Behavioral and Developmental Health Services here in Virginia. I would say that this is where I think people who are worried about CRTs in the schools, I would say that this is where their worries or their concerns or their anxieties are kind of valid, if this is the kind of material that's being, the type of resources that's being used.
What I know, and from the kids that I tutor here in New York, and I work with kids in the Department of Social Services, those kids, when I look at their homework, I don't see anything of that sort. It's more things like, why do you think that Jimmy, who lives in the Indian reservation, is worse off than you? Like, how does him being Native American and being affects his life? What about, if you're an immigrant from here? And I think kids who are in 10, 11, or 12 can definitely understand that. I think that is completely fine. I think this is just like when you teach geometry, you gotta first teach like circle theory. So you have to like teach them about different groups, different ethnic backgrounds.
Again, you're making it sound reasonable, and it probably is. I have no reason to think that would be dishonest about that. What I'm getting at is the other resources. Like we both agree, Robin DiAngelo is a terrible author, and that book is horrible. And yet HR departments are using her book as a resource on dealing with.
Oh yeah, I think this exists when you start having so the reason why these companies and these do it is for legal reasons, right? If there's some sort of workplace thing, they can get sued because we did this white fragility training, right? So you end up having laws and liability laws, which let people like Robin DiAngelo sell their book and their expertise as a way for the company to no longer be liable. And because these systems exist, they're able to get away with this charlatanry. So imagine going to a boardroom of like whatever Virginia State, be like, hey, if you do this, you won't be able to get sued. Have them do it, right? The boardroom kind of takes care of it. Yeah, in that respect, it's very problematic.
Yeah,
and if that's taught anywhere, it is abhorrent.
And this is and it's not so much a corporation that's doing it; it's the bloody state.
Yeah, but a lot of these departments are very decentralized, right? It's not like the legislators have much say, right? There's the guys in charge, the Department of Building, the BOE, for example. No one votes for the BOE. They have no accountability. They get elected by a group of representatives, and then they have their own doings to manage their departments.
Yeah, I guess the point I'm making is these aren't private institutions doing it. They're government institutions that are doing
Well,
it.
they're government funded, right? Like PBS,
Government, public institutions that are doing it.
publicly funded institutions, right? I think there's a difference. No one's electing or hiring the people to work at the BOE. They have their own system for doing
Yeah, I
that.
have no idea who in Richmond runs the Department of Behavioral Health.
I mean, you should look at that person, probably send them a strong letter, because that's that. I think that instead of just telling them this is bad, give them a solution. Oh, actually, you can teach this. Like, you can actually have like, hey, let's go to a seminar. You can't rape people. You can't sexually harass people. Like, this has been happening since the 80s. Now they just added one for racial tensions, and I think white fragility is a pretty bad idea.
I don't disagree with you on that at all. And so the way that the training works out is you have to listen to several slides, and then you have to type in an answer. It's no longer multiple choice or whatever. You actually have to type in your answer. And so diversity. Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean diversity of idea? Do you mean diversity of thought? Because everybody wants diversity of idea of thought, because no two people think the same way, and that's what you want. But if you're predicating diversity based on skin color, then that's reprehensible, because no people of the same race think alike, and it's kind of biased to think so. I actually typed out racist, but I'm trying to be more polite and charitable.
I would say that is not always true, right? For example, like you look at in Israel, at least, if you're like white skinned and you're a Jew, and you're Ashkenazi, for example, you're more likely to think a certain way than if you're from Sephardi background, just because of disparities that also always exist, just from a the descriptive standpoint. But when I look at diversity, I do think that ethnic background and cultural background matters. Of course, if you just look at race by itself, Aboriginals from Australia and Blacks from Africa share the same skin color, very different cultures.
Exactly. And their cultural backgrounds are going to influence how they think and view the world.
But in the United States, whether you're Aboriginal or you're Black from Africa, you still fall under the same statistics.
Which is rather unfortunate, because I've met
while accounting for it, you still fall under the same statistics, right? You'll still end up falling generally in the same group, and that's just a byproduct of the way America deals. Right? I think race, you and I would agree, the social construct. It's not like a serious thing we can make any scientific predictions on.
No.
Right.
And this kind of gets into other arguments I've had. Like I've been taken to task because I have a copy of, and I just haven't got to read it yet, of The Bell Curve by Charles Murray. And a person says, how dare you have that book? That's racist to have. It's like, why? Well, because
I think it's racist because of his academic brinksmanship in it, where he gets really close to making a point but doesn't make it. That's what they're criticized for. But as a whole, the book is really mostly about, because I've read it, it's mostly about how
it's the distribution
intelligence
of IQ,
and how society is selecting for intelligence.
Yeah, and so one of the questions I had is, well, okay, so what are the factors that are influencing this? Are we looking at socioeconomic status? Are we looking at is it possible, overrepresentations of intellectual disorders? There's so many different factors. How interested you are in, say, like abstract ideas, because somebody who's very interested in, say, mathematics, engineering, and science is probably going to be a hell of a lot more intelligent, probably have higher IQ than I do. That's just kind of how that goes.
I don't think it's necessarily because you're interested as the correlation.
Well, I mean, interested, I would say interest is at least one factor. There's probably several other factors. There's genetic factors that go into that too.
There might not even be any genetic factors. We don't even know, right? I don't think
that's right. We don't know.
But I think that as a whole, if we just look at cultures and the fact that we can measure disparity and cultural disparity ethnic disparity based on race. This is a marker that we use. Why not use that marker? It has predictive power. But I can use that marker, right? It's much harder to make these decisions on a large scale with race is a good marker we can use, regrettably, in the United States. It's like we know.
You're talking about IQ, correct?
No. I'm talking about anything. Predictor whether it's more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to lose a job, more likely to be sick. Race ends up being one of these metrics that we can just use. It's a data point that we can use. It's a data point that has prediction.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. I mean, when I did my master's in forensic psychology, I had to look at like the different factors that lead to incarceration. I also looked at, personality markers for more what would predict likelihood of false confessions. People
But
that are
I real quick, I do not think in any way, shape, or form that race has anything to do with IQ.
Oh no,
I'm just saying that I don't think at all.
I think culture has something to do with it. We can make an argument that Asian Americans have higher IQ than white Americans, and they're very conscientious people. They cultivate that kind of thing. They hold themselves to a high standard.
I think that IQ as a whole is a measure of much more of your
Of
ability
cognitive ability and how fast you can learn things.
And on that specific test, right? There's many actors, for example, who would be great actors, and in that space, that IQ doesn't really do anything for you. You can have an IQ of 150, 120. It makes less difference. You're much more looking at emotional intelligence, the ability to be creative, which IQ doesn't really measure.
Emotional intelligence, I think, is that's an interesting thing because you can't really measure.
Well, we have not figured out a way to measure it, right? There was also a time where we couldn't measure deductive ability.
But I would say you could probably look at traits, extroversion, and trait neuroticism for our emotional stability.
Maybe. I don't know. But
I mean, that's just looking at it as a personality psychologist. I would say that those are probably the two best factors that we can look at that might account for emotional intelligence as a psychological construct. It's like workplace success. The three best markers for that is IQ, trait conscientiousness, and grit, which is something that Angela Duckworth, I don't know if you've read her book on.
Yeah, but I don't know even how to measure grit. We keep talking.
There's a grit. She came up with a thing called the grit scale. I forget.
Yeah, but then we end up going back to, is it self-report? How did you get there? What's the internal validity of it? Can it really be used? Like, and then I think we're kind of like pontificating in like hypothesis land. Rather than,
well, she was trying to figure out why it is that kids that were high and conscientious and regular and relatively successful in their academic careers, when they went to West Point, many of them were dropping out. And that's not what you would expect. You would expect if someone's very successful academically in their high school careers, they should be breezing through something like that with no problem.
Yeah, so I know the book Grit. I know I've read that book. I understand but again, there's nothing there more than self-reports and a framework to understand things by. This framework has not been tested whatsoever and has not, these ideas have not been validated. And until that's the case, I just go, okay, that's a nice framework, but let me use the metrics that I can use. And this is why, like, again, CRT fights against race blind policy. Just like we looked at the Detroit issue. Yeah, that was a time when law needed to be made that cared about race, and no, schools need to have Black kids in them. Sorry, we need to integrate. We need to actually have integration. We need to desegregate. Right? This is one of those things where I think sometimes just looking at race isn't always racist. It's perpetuating systems and stuff. And again, now we're talking about sociology now.
And well, you bring up a good point too. It's, talking about race isn't always racist. You have to look into intent.
Not always intent. It could also be, like, I think that depending on the framework we're looking at, if we talk about interpersonal racism, it's always intent. It's always the way I behave towards you. It's always my attitudes towards you. But if we're talking about like overarching racism, political racism, these things have no intent, right? It's like a function. If you drop X into the function, you get Y. But if X happens to be Black, Y always generally happens to be lower statistically. We'll call the system racist in that respect. Right, it's a different framework, and I think one of the many failures of the left and someone on the left is messaging here. The rhetoric is so hard to digest, to simply use the word racist and expect people to know that you're talking about something entirely different, using jargon.
Well, maybe
It's like,
this is a good opportunity for us to clear up the misunderstanding we had over that meme I shared, where I was simply criticizing the validity of the rapid tests, because there's data coming out that if you've had, depending on your biology and your immune system, if you've had the 3 shots, you can actually test dirty even though you don't have coronavirus, because the spike proteins in your system, or the amount of the antibodies in your system, can kind of get you to pop positive. And so simply it was my thought was, this is interesting satire that, due to the information coming out, that basically if you have X amount of antibodies in your system, then your rapid test is about as reliable and valid as a fortune cookie.
Well, but again, for me, that meme you posted, I don't think, if you really glossed over it, I think you just pay attention to it next time, because that's an interesting.
This is why I said perhaps maybe if I add a little more context next time.
I don't think you need to add content. I think that meme just shouldn't be posted as it is. Change the picture, right? Don't do rolling the dice. Do like a die roll or something. Do something like change, because if what you're saying is true, I have no idea. I don't test. I don't care. I don't know anything about that. All I know is that rapid tests are useful for people who have symptoms. That way they can use them and see if they're COVID positive. If they get a COVID positive, they know right away to isolate. If they get a COVID negative, they know.
I've been looking at the vaccine research because my wife refuses to get a booster, and she has good reason, because of her pericarditis. The second shot made it worse.
Okay. And I don't know about your wife's personal experience, but what I'm talking about is that you get COVID, right? So for example, recently in my house we had a COVID scare. My brother got COVID. I ended up testing positive. I was asymptomatic entirely, but just because my older brother has sleep apnea and narcolepsy, so he usually has immune problems, so he ended up getting it. And as soon as he got sick, I was like, let's get a rapid test. The second he knew he could isolate, he didn't go to work, he didn't infect anyone, he got a PCR, right? And the PCR takes a few days to come back. That's the utility of the rapid test. So you can explain that without posting a meme, which the fortune cookies come out, and
I think memes are a good, quick and dirty heuristic way of satire and criticism.
Yeah, but that meme has more in it than simply straight criticism of the idea that you're talking about. And I can you imagine someone who already blames the Chinese for COVID?
I've met a few of them, and I've told them how dumb they are, because
but then they see the meme you post and they're like, yeah, they're vindicated. They spread that. Someone who doesn't know much, who've heard about, oh, look, these Chinese are fucking us with COVID again. But memes as a dirty, quick messaging has to be careful about its symbolism. You who study authoritarianism, you who study psychology, should know how easily these symbols are taken in from people who aren't careful about what they're reading.
Yeah, but most of the people that it kind of goes back to what I was saying. Most of the people that are on my page is private. Like, nobody that doesn't know me can see it. And that's because I don't want inmates from when I worked at the DAC knowing anything about me. And I don't want, the patients at Central State that, they get out and they get internet access. I don't want them to access my social media either.
Yeah, obviously.
So, people that see it or people that know.
Yeah, but Sean, if we go through your Facebook page, right, I think everyone there is rational and will see that and won't perpetuate any. So you have friends who, right, you don't think that has some bearing. First of all, the first thing I saw, I was like, this is just bigotry. This is just, I wasn't saying that you're a bigot. I was saying that the thing is bigotry behind soft humor, or I used the word poor humor. Because in a very sense, it is a little, like, these things are bigoted. It's clumping Chinese and with fortune cookies. It's making fun of their accents and the way they speak in conjunction with COVID. It's like all of these things put together is just like beating around the bush without saying that you're trying to hit the bush. Like, you're obviously going to destroy the dirt, you're destroying its roots, you're digging around it, but I'm not technically touching the bush. Yeah, you're not. But everything around this meme is just, it's ridiculous.
Most memes typically are ridiculous in a sense.
No, ridiculous in the sense that it's like, I'm not doing any Nazi propaganda, but right? No, obviously you can say something similar like socialized healthcare, right? I can spread socialized healthcare, but I straight socialized healthcare, and the picture I put under the picture is of white people standing all together with like, and then like a black person on the side, just like in poverty in the street. What I mean, either like, right, that messaging is a little bit more clear. I'm not bigot enough to think about this. Like the Chinese thing, the fortune cookie threw me off. Here, something very simple. Well, we know how the global elites are, and it's a picture of a guy with a yarmulke. Right, or the 1%, and it's a picture of Jews in Brooklyn, right, who are Goldman Sachs or something, and they're wearing a yarmulke at a bar mitzvah. It is Goldman Sachs, it is political elite, it is people, but right, what else is happening here? Right, there's a soft bigotry here hiding behind this meme.
I'll say that I just glossed over it and just saw fortune cookie, and they're not reliable. Obviously, if you're taking your advice from the little strip of paper inside a fortune cookie, I don't know what to tell you other than good luck with that, you know.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh, rapid test.
I think you just didn't think. Did you even read the papers before you posted it?
Not really. I just saw fortune cookies and went with it. When it came up as and I didn't even, and when I looked at the writing after it was pointed out, I was like, I don't see it as racist. Because
it's not racist. I agree with you. It's not racist.
Because here's the thing: if you go to any Chinese restaurant and you get fortune cookies, they're written poorly.
Yeah,
most of them are, and so that's why I don't see it as a problem. Because it's like, if you've ever eaten a fortune cookie or read a fortune in a fortune cookie, they're written horribly, and some of them
but again, but
exactly like that.
If you go and visit Goldman Sachs on their son's 13th birthday, they're wearing yarmulkes. How many people, secular Jews, have you seen wearing yarmulkes? But that's not the point.
I've never met a person that wears a yarmulke in real. Well, no, that's not true. There was a correctional officer at Greensville that I worked with who was Orthodox Jewish and wore a yarmulke, and he was just like, I don't understand why I can't wear it underneath my goddamn hat, is how he put it. But he was a funny fellow. I really like the hell out of that guy.
Well, my point is that you can make that argument, but well, the point is that this has so much history behind it, and currently with COVID and the things that happened in the past 2 years, so you're not denying the fact that anti-Asian sentiment and violence demonstrably
no,
grew.
and I think anybody that thinks that it's the fault of Chinese people is low resolution thinking.
Yeah,
and you know, it's kind of like when I talked to Caleb about it yesterday, it's like, dude, Chinese people are not the Chinese Communist Party. If we're going to try to hold anybody accountable, it should be the Chinese government, because they kind of hid it for a couple of weeks before they said, oh, by the way, we've got this problem.
If we look at the problem in the U.S., it was clearly the Trump administration problem.
Oh,
they knew months before it happened.
Well,
before he even came out and said it was a problem, he just denied that it was even happening.
Well, I would say that, you know, in the grand scheme of things, all over the world, all things considered, I don't think country one got it goddamn right.
I think some countries got it absolutely better than others. Israel did it much better. New Zealand did it much better. Australia did it much better.
So Australia's kind of lost their goddamn minds a bit too, I think. But
I mean, so when we look at Australia, look at the riots there. The majority of the population.
That's not the thing that bothers me. If they want to protest and riot, riot. No,
I'm saying most people there are on the side of what's happening. Right? A large majority are okay with it. They're like, okay, I'm okay with this vaccinating stuff. I'm okay with this. They don't have an issue. I mean, it's a country that's already used to compulsory voting. Like, you can't not vote in Australia. You get fined.
Well, I would say that, you know, the fact that they have that quarantine camp, I think, is a problem. Personally, that's what
personally, that's fine. You don't live there, right?
That's right. I don't live there, but I think that's a step in the wrong direction, and history has shown that that's not good. I mean, I criticize the United States still for what happened after the bombing or the attack in Pearl Harbor with the internment camps for the Japanese citizens. That was fucking wrong.
Yeah, well, I don't think that vaccinated versus unvaccinated is a protected class, but I think you are making a decision here.
But I don't think that your government should take you from your home and stick you in a damn camp. just because you're
I
suspected.
mean, I don't
of being
know. I don't
around.
know. I don't know specifically what's happening in Australia on
The
that
Howard
ground.
Springs National Center for Resilience was originally set up if you were traveling into Australia, you had to quarantine for 2 weeks. If you're coming as an international traveler. Fair enough.
What's
man.
wrong with that?
Fair enough. Right? Fair enough. And then it became, well, if you're suspected of being around somebody who's tested positive for COVID, you have to go, or else. And the or else is a equivalent to a $50,000 fine.
I haven't heard about that, so I guess I just take your word. But I don't know enough
Well,
to even
you
talk
can
about
find
that.
some art. You can find the articles through Google. They talk about it on CBS. In fact, I think not CBS like the US. I think there's a CBS.au or something there. There's all kinds of different Australian news
What would you
sources.
call it, Howard?
It's
Because
the
I
Howard
recently
Springs.
spoke.
It's the Howard Springs Center for National Resilience, is what they call it now.
Because I know that I recently spoke with Jolly from the Penguin Discord, and he was telling me about how he wasn't. I asked him about that, and he was like, "Oh, I don't know anything. Like, I don't think that's a big deal. I don't know what's happening." And he lives in Australia, so
It's
let me see.
it's located near Darwin, Australia, in the
Yeah,
Northern
what I
Territory.
learned inside.
And there was a woman that talked about her time there that she lied to the police about taking a COVID test, and she didn't. And they had her go to this place for 2 weeks, and you can't go off your porch. They have a yellow line painted. You can't go out of your room. You can't go talk to people. And
But they took people who are Australian citizens outside of their home.
yeah,
Okay, I will have to look. I guess we'll just move out of this conversation because I don't know enough about this to talk.
yeah. But I would say that the idea, to me, that's a step too far.
If that's happening, sure.
So and Tim Pool has talked about it a bit on his Timcast RL.
Yeah, I can't trust him, honestly.
I don't like the mainstream media. I don't like Fox or CNN or any of them.
Yeah, I don't like them. I also don't like Tim Pool. I think he's an absolute grifter. I mean, I trust Reuters, AP. I'm okay with The Hill.
The Hill's okay. They're more center. I try to stay away from pure right or pure left.
I mean, I think so. I mean, you know the Ad Fontes media chart?
I am not familiar with it now.
Basically, they did research about quantifying left versus right political stuff. They have a horizontal scale and a vertical scale. Vertical, as low as you go, it's disinformation. As up as you go, it's like strict only information. It's not like it's not opinion. And then left, right, etc. And you end up finding that like on the fringes you have like TYT, the Jimmy Dore show, and then you have like Fox News, RT, Ben Shapiro, Daily Wire, Tim Pool on the right. As you go up towards the middle, you end up having entirely other things. Like you'll find the New York Times like top and a little bit to the left. The Hill is like top center. Reuters and AP are all the way at the top. This is easily researched. Just look at Fontes Media. Yeah. So I'll just have to look
know
that
they've
up.
talked about it, and they shared part of the video interview they did where she talked about like all the restrictions at the camp, and it was basically you go there, you have to pay a $5,000 fine.
So I think for me at least, it's getting a bit late, and but last thing I want to talk to you about, and I think this is a thing where we might find disagreement, is I really do believe that one of Jordan Peterson's biggest issues is twofold. I think that he denounces postmodernism while engaging in postmodernism consistently, especially through a meta overarching narrative that like a Jungian type that is for me entirely postmodernist. And I also think that he's unaware that he very much perpetuates cultural Marxism conspiracy theory that is parroted from Nazism and cultural Bolshevism. And these are like my biggest gripes with him. And I know that someone's a Peterson fan. Like, what do you think about these two statements I just made?
Well, I mean, the criticism of postmodernism is and again, I've read Stephen Hicks's book on explaining postmodernism, and I've
by the way, I was taught in school as so a professor gave us like a bunch of his points, but like how postmodernism started with Kant and stuff like that, and we remember in class he like gave answers whether it's true or false, and people were like, and then he told us, oh, this is true, and like people in class were getting mad at him, Like, there's no way this is true. We use that book as a metric for how not to understand postmodernism in many respects. So
from what I gather with it when it comes to postmodernism, is the first axiom of postmodernism is true, the second one not so much. And that is that there are near infinite amount of ways in which to perceive and interpret a finite amount of phenomena. That there's a near infinite ways of interpreting any given set of anything, right? Works for text, works for the way we perceive and act in the world and everything else like that. The second axiom, because the first one, that's actually the AI guys, the people that were researching artificial intelligence kind of ran into the same problem on how do you get robots that are able to perceive and act in the world like we do. But the world isn't a world of objects that you have to try to maneuver around and manipulate. The world is a place in which you act. The second axiom of postmodernism is that no interpretation is to be held more value. What is it? No interpretation is more valid than any other interpretation. So it's all open all the way down. But
well, interpretation is different than like analysis, right? Interpretation is like, what does this mean for us? Right? That's, I think, what they're talking about. They're not talking about descriptive claims. They're talking about more about like specific normative claims. So like, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean for us that X is a thing? There's an infinite amount of these interpretations. And yeah, one of them, they're not really that, there's no objectivity to why one is more valid than another.
Right. But we actually inhabit a value laden framework. That's how we.
Yeah. And then you look at Nietzsche's work, right? Nietzsche's work talks about morality, and the genealogy of morals specifically talks about how these moral frameworks themselves are also not anything objective, right? That's his whole work. It's an moral anti-realism. So like, this is where I get really confused with this harsh criticism of postmodernism when he himself engages in postmodernism consistently. Jungian overarching analysis. This is a postmodern.
Well, I thought postmodernism was a rejection of grand narratives.
No, not at all. They're not rejecting.
Well, then you and Caleb would disagree on that, because Caleb says that that's exactly what postmodernism.
They don't reject grand narratives. They reject it. They have counter narratives. They reject the idea that a grand narrative is correct. Say, well, there can be different overarching narratives. Like all of Foucault's work is look at the grand narrative of like the panopticon and the justice system and what it means. Right? It's not just like you look at history as a narrative of things. Right? You look at the way you have a narrative for the United States, freedom, anti-tyranny, blah, 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 blah. But the narrative of, in slavery, subjugation of blacks is also apparent in that narrative. They're both equal, right? Not one is more true than the other. They both exist, but these are both different narratives. This is a postmodern idea. It's okay to have like it. So like Jordan Peterson say, look at the narrative of Hamlet, for example. There's an overarching method of it. There's an overarching. Postmoderns agree with that. But they don't consider that truth. And that's what they say. Well, there's no truth in overarching narratives. They're subjective in a sense. Postmodern historians will say something along the lines, it doesn't matter if George Washington actually chopped down the cherry tree. People believe it did. So in history, we should consider as if it's true, right? This is the mythos of the people. This is their narrative about what's happening. That is their history. Whether it's actually history or not actually history.
Okay, but still the idea that no interpretation is more valid than any other, but through a Darwinian process, because of our biological framework, there's actually many constraints on the amount of valid interpretations of the world in which way that we perceive the world and act out in the world. Because if there were if no interpretation is more valid than any other, then we wouldn't be able to act, and that would not.
You can still act. You can still believe. You can still believe that yours is more valid, but it's not objective, right? Because postmodernism is a critique of modernism. It's a critique of where modernism messed up, right? They just critique modernism and the things that modernists assumed, which were things like narratives, like the Western canon narrative as the true one. They're like, no, there isn't a true narrative. Other narratives are valid. You can disagree with it, right? But it doesn't mean that they're not valid.
Okay. And well, I mean, again, like I said, I've read the one book on postmodernism. So this is how I've come to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess more to your what was your second question about Peterson again? Something
No,
about
I brought up only postmodernism as this thing that he engages in postmodernism much of the time. Like, oh, what do you mean by truth? Well, you know what I mean by truth. Any modernist will tell you truth is that which is independent of our mind. That's how we speak about it, right? Or true in the sense, right? That's like for even Kant, who makes a distinction between phenomenology and the noumenal, the phenomenal noumenal. But like phenomenal is and the spectacles and the objective reality, the one that exists, is that's the true one. We will never know, right? Can't even postmodernists reject that. They go, phenomenology is true, right? They go, oh, me experiencing a color, it's true. It's just as true as that which is independent of my mind. These are two different truths. Right? And Peterson does the same thing. Well, what do you mean by true? Well, you know, as a modern, that's a postmodernist answer. I'm okay with it. I actually like the answer. But and then so he criticizes postmodernism while entertaining postmodernism by liking Nietzsche. I mean, there's a great book, I think I sent it to you, called Jung and the Postmodernist, which is Jung himself in many respects is a postmodernist. And critiques it while simultaneously criticizing the Frankfurt School and engaging in what is borderline a anti-Semitic conspiracy theory with cultural Marxism. He just calls them postmodern neo-Marxists.
Okay, so the neo-Marxist claim. This is how I understand it. And again, this very bare surface understanding. So if I get something wrong, then feel free to correct me if I get it wrong.
Okay.
But the way I understand it is that because of the reinterpretation or the different the many interpreted the many interpretations that work within a postmodern framework, you can kind of redefine any of the terms, right? It's like, what definition or what interpretation of the text is true? And so the classical Marxist presupposition is the world is a battleground between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the rich and the poor, the working class versus the capitalists. And it's been a while since I've read the Communist Manifesto, but this is kind of this is my understanding of it.
The Communist Manifesto is like the praxis, like what he thought needed to happen. But that's not Marxism proper, right? Marxism proper is like Das Kapital,
which I don't have a copy of, and I haven't read it. So
you just watch it. I think it's such a boring book anyhow. Like I've only read excerpts from it. I haven't read the whole thing.
I found a copy that has the Communist Manifesto and like a very brief, like I guess what would you call it, like a footnotes version of Das Kapital. Because capital.
Do you know what I mean? But you know what I mean by cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, right?
I'm not really familiar with the whole accusation against the Frankfurt School, other than James Lindsay has come out.
Do you mind if I just read you the Wikipedia page real quick?
Go for it.
The first couple of paragraphs. Cultural Marxism is a far-right anti-Semitic conspiracy theory which claims that Western Marxism as the basis of continuing academic and intellectual efforts to subvert Western culture. It claims that the elite of Marxist theories and Frankfurt School's intellectuals are subverting Western society with a culture war that undermines Christian values of traditionalist conservatism and promotes cultural liberal values of the 1960s counterculture, multiculturalism, progressive politics, and political correctness, misrepresenting as identity politics created by critical theory. With roots in the Nazi propaganda term, cultural Bolshevism, the conspiracy theory originated in the United States during the 1990s. While originally only found on the far-right political fringe, the term began to enter mainstream discourse in the 2010s and is now found globally. The conspiracy theory of a Marxist culture war is promoted by many right-wing politicians, fundamentalist religious leaders, political commentators in the mainstream, and white supremacist terrorism. Scholarly analysis of the conspiracy theory has concluded that it has no basis in fact. Now, I know that Peterson isn't saying that specifically, but just like Sam Harris's model of like eccentric circles of radicalism, where like in the middle you have like jihadists who will literally like commit the crime and commit terror. You have those around them that support them. I very much believe that Peterson hangs out in those supporting boundaries and perpetuates this conspiracy theory.
So again, my understanding of postmodern Marxism is the idea that instead of interpreting the Marxist doctrines in the framework of bourgeoisie and proletariat or say class, right? So basically saying that maybe changing the oppressor versus oppressed from bourgeoisie and proletariat to whites versus blacks, or males versus everybody, or white males versus everybody else, something of that nature. That's how Marxism has come to be redefined through postmodernism. That's how I've understood that to be. Now, I don't know if that's in line with this far right conspiracy theory, or my understanding of it is different. I don't know. That's how I've come to understand it. But I do know that there was a Italian Marxist philosopher by the name of Antonio Francesco Gramsci, who talked about how the theory of cultural hegemony, which describes how the state and ruling capital class use cultural institutions to maintain power in capitalist societies. And in his view, using ideology rather than violence or economic force or even coercion, but using hegemonic culture and its own values and norms so that they become more like common sense values to maintain the status quo, that perhaps using the Marxist framework within that idea, kind of using culture against the bourgeoisie. But he was imprisoned by Benito Mussolini and the fascists. And I think,
yeah, fascists don't like Marxism. That's where cultural Bolshevism comes from.
And so that's kind of my understanding of it.
Yeah.
But like I said, my ideas on fascism, Nazism, and even what would you call Leninist, Stalinist, communist dictatorships, that all those presuppositions have been kind of blown apart at the moment. And I'm still trying to parse through that, because James actually sent me some videos by a historian by the name of Tick on YouTube that actually argues that National Socialism is race-based socialism, much in the same vein as communism or socialism is class-based, but replacing class with race. And that's how you kind of got the Nazis. So it's more of a left-wing authoritarian totalitarian movement rather than right-wing.
Well, I think that when we're right wing and left wing, I think it's best to understand as trying to maintain hierarchy versus break down the hierarchy, eliminate it. The Nazi Party wanted to maintain the hierarchy of white German ethno-nationalists,
and that's how I understood it. But the Tick makes an argument that Nazism is actually more of a left phenomena than a right phenomena.
I mean, then he's entirely out of the academic political science academic consensus,
because the way that he looks at it is that if you were to look at extreme right, it would just be anarchy, because it would be absolute individualism over
but right versus, we're not talking about the valence of north and south authoritarianism. Right and left are maintaining the hierarchies as they are versus abolishing the hierarchies. So as you go more left, it's about abolishing.
I understood. I know that, because that's the framework that I operated in. But again, it's like these are ideas that I'm hearing that I'm like trying to actually sort out. Because Tick's argument is that Nazism, fascism, and Marxist socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, they're all left-wing movements.
I think that's absurd. I don't know why he would do that. What conceptual utility does he gain from doing that? It doesn't explain anything. If anything, it goes against tons of political theory and tons of any academic understanding of this stuff.
So like one of the first videos the one video that I've listened to yet, like I said, James has sent me those, and me and James were actually having this conversation earlier today before I went to work, because I was like, it doesn't make any sense. And he's like, well, all you're doing when you add left or when you add the y axis is you just overcomplicate it, because from the right perspective is individualism, and therefore the far right would be anarchism, because it's all individuals and there's no
but you can have a right wing community. Left doesn't mean just community. You can have you have like anarcho.
I think it's the collective. I think it's the individualist versus collectivist ideas.
During the Russian Revolution, the communists would have been on the right. They're trying to maintain the hierarchies, or those who are trying to break them apart will be on the left. They're trying to take away those hierarchies.
Yeah,
That's why
I've heard that argument because people think that Stalin and Lenin were right wing aberrations
I
within.
mean, they're not right wing from the way that today we see it. Like they would be on the left today, right? They'd be left authoritarianism, but from their internal perspective, breaking down those hierarchies would mean breaking down the way the system is currently.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you or disagreeing with
I would have to watch the videos. I guess I would have to watch the videos. But
yeah, he's on YouTube because his definition of fascism I thought was very interesting because he says basically what it means is it's national trade unionism is what fascism is.
It's a lot of things. It's like state capitalism plus ethno-nationalism. I mean, I think Umberto's 14 points make a better understanding of fascism than almost anything else. But it is getting really late for me. It's already probably for you, it's almost 3 a.m. So,
well, okay, then
maybe we can pick it up another time.
Okay, well, yeah, this probably is a good place to stop because but before we end this though, the way that I kind of define the postmodern Marxism as I understand it, is that a derivative of the conspiracy theory, or is my understanding of it different than that? Or
I think that your way of understanding postmodernism is like the way David Hicks understands it, and I think that it's a disservice to postmodernism because just like any philosophical school, right? Just like we don't take modernism. Modernism was a critique of the philosophy that came before it. Postmodernism is critique of modernism, and we're going to have postmodernism eventually. And I think it's already there. So
yeah, because I'm philosophically tilted more toward existentialism than anything else.
Yeah, I think, and again, I think postmodern is also like that term that kind of there has yet to have been the historical time to really say what's been happening and calling it. We're simply calling everything that's happened after modernism postmodernism. But when you look at modernism, and at the time of the development of modernism, they didn't have a name for it. No one called it modernism. It was called contemporary or post-enlightenment philosophy. That's kind of what they call it.
Because I think Nietzsche also gets thrown into the postmodern arena from time to time.
Yeah, he definitely is. Especially with his moral anti-realism. That's entirely postmodern. But I mean, again, I'm super tired, so I might not be as coherent as I can be. I think the best way to understand postmodernism is a criticism
is to go read the philosophers themselves, like Hegel and
no, Hegel would have been like the progenitor. He would be like the thing that inspired them. But just looking at postmodernists, I think the best way to understand is they're critiquing the things that modernists assumed, just took for granted, or had a blind spot to. Like when we're talking about modernists, we're talking about Kant, Locke, Rousseau, these guys.
Rousseau was an interesting character historically.
Yeah,
I did buy a couple of his books. They're sitting on the shelf. I just haven't got to them either. Right now, I just finished a book by a Jungian analyst on owning your shadow, and now I'm currently getting into a history of the Nazi genocide.
Have you read Opening Skinner's Box?
No, I have not.
It's a great book too.
I'll have to add that to my
growing list. Insane list. Also, a great book to add is if you ever care about like Israeli-Palestinian stuff, The Haifa Republic by Omri Bohem is a fantastic book in my opinion on the topic.
You'll have to send me these through Messenger so that way I can actually write them down and then go search for them on Amazon.
Yeah,
I found a really cool used bookstore, so I found like all kinds of like old books.
That's awesome.
I found a copy of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents.
Yep.
That
yep.
An interesting book to read. And
so I actually took a literature and psychoanalysis class, and I actually find that the psychoanalysts are their psychoanalysis is much better at like understanding literature and like mapping around like things in the literary world and actually applying to humans. And I found that fun. So like in that class, I actually learned the most about psychoanalysis from Freud, Adler, and Jung. We did so much work into those guys and like how to read stories through their lenses.
Well, that would make sense because, like I said, Jung is very hard to understand outside of a narrative sense because of his work with the archetypes. So
yeah, they all believe that you can find like through stories and stuff into psychology, symbolism, and all that nonsense.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, I agree. This was fun, Sean. We should do it again. Maybe
Absolutely.
in like
I
2
would look
years after we
forward
can
to it.
schedule it.
I would look forward to it. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me at such a short notice.
It's okay. I'm kind of like I have less work, school this in between semesters and stuff. So you know how it is.
Oh yeah.
Okay, man. Have a great morning, I guess.
You too.